It's Logan. Just west.
It's a history book, but I thought you might like it. Since your teacher's
Okay, let's go ahead and get started. As always, we have a lot of ground to cover today. And those of you that have been in the class, we are in chapter 12. And just very quickly as a review, you may remember that Revelation is really divided into four distinct sections. Chapter 1 is introduction, where God tells John, I want you to reveal something to my people, both then and now. Chapter 2 and 3 is the message to the seven churches of Asia that Jesus delivers to them. And we spent quite a bit of time looking at what Jesus was saying in those first century churches and what we can draw from us. Chapters 4 through 11 that we just completed last Sunday morning is the first major part of Revelation as far as the revelation or the apocalypse or the revealing or the unveiling, whatever term you want to use, they're all correct, they're all synonymous. And Jesus, our God, if you'll remember, is giving this message to his people, again, both then and now, giving this message. And what is the message? As succinctly as possible, what would you say the message of Revelation? We're going to win, God's going to win. Very good. Good way to summarize it. In fact, I think you could even use one word to summarize Revelation for God's people. It's victory. It's victory. And as we've talked about over and over and over again, I apologize for the redundancy. Over and over and over again, these people were suffering severely under the oppression of the Roman Empire. And not just the Roman Empire, but also many of the Gentiles, because they seemed to feel like their gods and goddesses with little g's were being attacked. And also, many of the Jews themselves, of course, were battling against the Christians. So these people were enduring horrible, horrible situation. And there was this necessary, very necessary message that was saying, hey, you be faithful. Revelation 2:10, be faithful even unto death, and I'll give you a crown of righteousness. You're going to win. We finished that first, if you want to say, rendition of the Revelation in chapters 4 through 11. Now, as I've said over and over again, chapters 12 through 21, John is going to reveal the same message. Exactly the same message. He's going to use different symbolism, different emphasis, different Old Testament, but it's all the same message. And, a lot of people want to take that, and as we have talked about, unfortunately, lots of misinterpretation about Revelation. Lots of, I don't think necessarily intentional, but I think people just don't understand it. And we've talked about the fact that people by and large are afraid of Revelation. Why? Very good. They don't understand the Old Testament prophecy. They don't understand the Old Testament symbolism. They don't understand the symbolism of the first century, and they don't understand apocalyptic literature. And you've got to understand that before we can make application today. We've got to understand what was being said to them. And you're going to see it today. There's some, just on surface value, some scary things in Revelation. We're going to see this massive beast, a dragon today. And people say, oh, Revelation's scary. It's not. And it's not a secret code. I've heard that from pulpits before where preachers have said it was a secret code so that the Romans would know what was being said. Well, they did too know, because as we said, apocalyptic literature was the most popular literature in really about 500 years. Hundreds and hundreds of apocalyptic works. Anything in the Bible that's apocalyptic in nature? Oh, yeah, we've looked at a whole bunch of it, hadn't we? And we're going to look at more of it today. So we're going to start with chapter 12 today. And chapter 12, just like so much of Revelation, is a vision. John's having another vision. In fact, there are basically two visions, almost split directly in half in chapter 12. The first vision is broken up into four, what John refers to as signs. Just portions or segments of this vision. And all of them, if we go back to the Old Testament, and if we go back to first century symbolism, we'll understand very readily what they are. And it's really, chapter 12 is kind of a synopsis of everything we saw in chapters 4 through 11. And so just reflect back on some of this as we go along. Now, beginning in chapter 12, verse 1, a great sign appeared in heaven. Like I say, there are 4 signs that we're going to see here in the first half of chapter 12. A woman clothed with the sun and the moon, and under her feet and on her head were a crown of 12 stars. Now, if you go, we're not going to because of time restrictions, but if you go back to Psalm 104, you'll see kind of a similar description of a time. In Psalm 104 is godliness. And so this symbol, this woman, appears to have some connection to God. And that 12 crowns that you look at gives us an idea who we're talking about here. Because we've already, or 24 several times in the past. What does that represent? But to God's people, the 12 apostles in the New Testament, the 12 tribes of the Old Testament, the 24 elders that we talked about back in the early stages of Revelation, to God. And she was to the birth. Tell you, and I think you'll understand more of this here. Scholars say that this symbol represents Messianic community. You hear the word Messianic, what does that tell you? Jesus, and Dr. Fair, under whom I studied intently, he said the same thing. Think about how long had God's people looked for a Messiah. And what's another word for the Messiah? Christ. And if you had to define the Messiah, it certainly was Christ. A Savior. Anybody know right offhand? Where's the first Messianic prophecy that we find in the Bible? Genesis, the 3rd chapter. And the setting is where?
He's going to strike him, his head.
Yes, he says, you shall bruise his heel. Talking about the devil bruising, again, symbolism. But you shall bruise his head. What was that mean? What that mean? Genesis 3rd chapter, that Messianic prophecy.
It's talking about when Christ was raised from the dead. Because the Satan told Eve, you shall, that one word, not die. He lied. But it happened at Christ being raised from the dead, overcoming death.
That's true, and we're going to see that at the end of this chapter. That is going to be the death knell of Satan. But right now he's saying, what happens is these people had been longing ever since literally the Garden of Eden for a Savior. Because when they sinned, what does sin do? What does sin always do? Separates you from God is death. For all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God, Romans 3:23 and Romans 6:23, for the wages of sin is what? Death. And so something had to be done. Well, all the way back in the Garden of Eden, God knew what he's going to do. He knew how he's going to defeat Satan and take away, if you want to call it this, Satan's trump card. And so these people are looking for, since thousands and thousands of years, looking for a Savior, the Messiah. Where does the pain and the anguish come in here? I'll give you a hint back when we first started, back in chapter 4. And the Christians, the faithful Christians, were crying out and had a question for God. How long? How long? And so just like in the case of physical childbirth, there's that pain, there's that anguish, but there's that anticipation. There's something joyous. That's a neat kind of deal to talk about on Mother's Day, isn't it? It's going to happen. And so he's talking, and like I say, the first 9 verses here, he's kind of encapsulating the whole story that we have here. But then there's a second sign or a second symbol that comes up. Then another sign appeared in heaven, and behold, a great red dragon, having 7 heads and 10 horns on its heads, were 7 diadems. Now, I admit that's kind of a frightening picture right there. And again, there's really no debate. This red dragon represents whom? It's Satan. And if you understand the symbolism of the first century, and particularly the Canaanite world, you see the Canaanites, they had a mythological creature they called Leton, which was also, the Hebrews called it Leviathan. Came up out of the sea. We've talked about before, anything that comes out of the sea was representing what? Evil, bad, yes, the demonic force. And Leton or Leviathan was red, and he was a dragon. And you want to guess how many heads he had in Canaanite myth? He had 7 heads. And he also had on his head a bunch of horns. And so when he mentions this right here, immediately they think about this Canaanite myth. Now, in this Canaanite myth, the king, which was sometimes seen as Baal in the Canaanites, he was expecting a son, and Leviathan was going to destroy the son. And ultimately, the king destroyed Leviathan. So they know all this. We call it a folk tale, this hypothetical story. They understood all that. And if you look at this here, let's go back to something we've looked at before. Go back to Daniel, the 7th chapter. You remember Daniel, the 7th chapter? Daniel, about 600 years before this, a little over 600 years, Daniel had a vision of 4 beasts that came up out of the sea. Y'all remember that? And each of those beasts we talked about, we looked at archaeological evidence, we looked at historic evidence, we looked at evidence from some of the apocalyptic literature of the day. Those 4 beasts represented what in Daniel's vision? Empires. And every one of those empires were a thorn in the side to God's people. The first empire, again, no question, was Babylon. Second empire was the Medo-Persian Empire. Third empire, or third beast that he talks about, was the Macedonian or Greek Empire, Alexander the Great, Philip his father, Philip of Macedon. And then the fourth empire was what? Rome, which is fascinating to me as a historian. This is 600 plus years before Christ. At least 300 years before Rome even shows up on the map. And yet he's prophesying. And if you look at the 7th verse of that 7th chapter of Daniel, after this I kept looking at the night visions, and behold, a 4th beast, dreadful and terrifying and extremely strong, and it had large iron teeth. It devoured and crushed and trampled down the remainder with its feet. And it was different from all the other beasts before it, and it had, what? 10 horns. Can you see how these people would readily understand what was going on here? And if you look, there's another passage of Scripture, I believe it's the Psalm 74. Yeah, 74. In the myth, the Canaanite myth, it is Baal, or a king of the Canaanites, that destroys Leviathan. But look at verse 13 of Psalm 74. The psalmist is speaking to God here. You divide the sea by your strength. You broke the heads of the sea monsters in the waters. You crushed the heads of Leviathan, and you gave him as food for creatures of the wilderness. What was the psalmist saying? And what is John in this new vision, if you will? What's he saying? Evil's going to be defeated. Now keep in mind, these people, they don't see it. They don't see it. Because Rome seems to be unbeatable. They say it'd be omnipotent. Can't beat Rome. Rome spread all over the then known world. But John is prophesying, just like Daniel had prophesied. It will, because if you read on down in Daniel, the 7th chapter, you all know, because we talked about it before, what does Daniel prophesy is going to happen to Rome 700 years before it ever shows up? Rome and God's people are going to be what? Victorious. Daniel prophesies that. The psalmist prophesies that. John prophesies that. Now, it's still a couple of hundred years before Rome really meets its decline. but we have the same story that he's talking about here. Satan's going to be defeated, and Satan's minions, if you will, are going to be defeated as well. Now, if you keep going here in verse 5, and she gave birth to a son, a male child who is to rule all the nations with a rod of iron. Now, we've seen that before. There's no question this third sign is whom? It's Christ. No doubt in the world. Do you remember the significance of a rod of iron? We talked about this a long, long time ago. In fact, before we started, just that little brief segment where I did the 7 churches of Asia.
I think the NIV gives a little better, or at least my version, a little better description.
Okay.
An iron scepter.
Okay.
Which we know what a scepter
Right.
is for rulers.
Right. And we went back, we talked about back in the Revelation 2nd chapter, John is describing, or the angel's describing Jesus. And Jesus breaks the clay pots with a rod of iron. Now, we referred back, this was an old Egyptian custom. If you remember when a new Pharaoh came to the throne, we talked about they had a ritual. The clay pots were put before the new Pharaoh. And he took a rod of iron and he broke every single pot. What were they saying? The old is gone. There's a new sheriff in town. And what he thinks and what he does is he's in charge. Well, Jesus here, if you look at this, he says he's going to rule all the nations with a rod of iron. Now that's going to include what empire? Rome. And they know that. And then if he goes on, and the child was caught up to God and to his throne. Was that going to happen? Sure it was. And then if you look, verse 6 again, we talked about this. And then the woman fled into the wilderness. Think for a minute, how many times in the Old Testament, particularly the Old Testament, was the wilderness a rough, tough, undesirable place, but who was always there taking care of his people? God was. Always. Always. I mean, from the Exodus from Egypt, they spent 40 years out there, their own fault for their unfaithfulness, even despite the fact it was their own doing that put them in that wilderness for 40 years. God was there. He's feeding them. He's clothing them. He's taking care of them. He's protecting them. And then you start going through. You remember not too long ago, I mentioned in a sermon that I preached in 1 Kings, the 16th, 17th, the 18th chapter, God takes Elijah. He'd been prophesying to Ahab, and Ahab's trying to kill him. He takes Elijah completely out of Israel into the wilderness east of the Jordan River. And the whole time, who took care of Elijah while he's out there in the wilderness? God did. And over and over and over, we see the same thing. And look at this, because I know you know this. I know you remember this. So that she would be nourished for 1,260 days. Now, we talked about there are 3 different numbers that crop up. 3.5 years, 42 months, 1,260 days, and all of them are the exact time frame. And none of them are to be understood literally. It simply means, we see it in Revelation, and really a lot of apocalyptic literature, it always represented what? A time of persecution. And so there's no ambiguity here. Hey, as long as Rome's still here, as long as Satan's still running wild on the earth, there's going to be persecution. There's going to be trouble. There's going to be difficulty. But who's going to be there with you? God's going to be with you. And you're faithful, you will be victorious. Now, the 4th sign, and this one's, there's lots of controversy, and I respectfully say a lot of misinterpretation. And there was a war in heaven. Michael and his angels waging war against the dragon. Who's Michael? He's one of the archangels. In fact, let's just go back. Let's see, I believe it's Daniel, the 12th chapter. I believe it's where I want to go back. Daniel, the 12th chapter. And Daniel is basically having the same vision that John's having right here. Daniel, the 12th chapter, verse 1. Now at that time, Michael, the great prince who stands, look at this is very important, stands guard over the sons of your people will arise. And there will be a time of distress such as never occurred since there was a nation until that time. And at that time, your people, everyone who is found written in the book, we've seen that before, shall be what? Rescued. And so there again is this promise, this protection that is over people, even when they're being persecuted by. Now, a lot of people talk about this. There's a lot of controversy about when and what happened, but the bottom line is, you keep going, verse 8 and 9, and there was no longer a place found for them in heaven. And the great dragon was thrown down, the serpent of old, who is called the devil and Satan, who deceives the whole world. He was thrown down to earth. If you noticed up there a moment ago, it talked about the fact that in verse 4 that he swept down a third of the stars of heaven and threw them, that was the devil, threw them to the earth. Now the Hebrews, there's nowhere in the Bible, but the Hebrews believed that when Satan was thrown out of heaven, that a third of the angels were following him and they were thrown out too. Now again, that is Hebrew tradition. That's not in the Bible. But the bottom line is, what is the significance of Satan being ejected, if you will, from heaven? What is the significance of Satan being thrown out of heaven, ejected from heaven?
Satan then, and still does, want to be God. Because he asked Jesus, if you'll bow down to me, on those 40 days he was in the wilderness, that's what he was after in heaven. Of course, he had followers, and they went with him out of heaven at the time too.
Right, very good point. The bottom line is, he's removed from, if you want to call it, the source of power. He's removed. Now, this is important because a lot of people want us to put this at the end of time. Satan's already been removed from heaven. And as we shall see in the second half of this vision, Satan's already been defeated. That doesn't mean that he's not still powerful. That doesn't mean that he's not inflicting all kinds of pain and horror on God's people. But he's been defeated, he's been thrown, and we'll look at this very quickly here. Then I heard a loud voice in heaven, verse 10, say, now the salvation and the power and the kingdom of our God and the authority of Christ have come, for the accuser of our brethren has been thrown down, he who accuses them before our God and day and night. What does that say? What did verse 10 just say? He's the ultimate authority. But Satan's still doing what? Accusing and inflicting, again, all kinds of pain and anguish on God's people. And in fact, if you look at verse 11, and they overcame him, and it tells us how Satan was defeated. I like to think about this way as a military historian. The war's been won. The battles are still raging. You know, I can sit here and cite you all kinds of historic evidence where somebody's been defeated, but they keep fighting. And we see that very clearly with Satan right here. What was the ultimate sign of victory? Satan being defeated. What was the ultimate? When did it happen? Well, that's true. When on earth did we see Satan, the final death knell, if you will?
The resurrection.
Yeah, the cross and the resurrection. That's exactly right. When Christ arose from the dead, Satan had just played his trump card, death. And that's what we talked about all the way back to the Garden of Eden. When man sinned, he separated himself from God and brought about eternal death. God had a way to handle that. And so we look at this. It says, and because of the word of their testimony, and they did not love their life even when they were faced with death. Again, same thing that the little church at Smyrna was told in Revelation 2:10. You be faithful even unto death, and what? You're going to win. Satan can't beat you. Satan was defeated when Christ rose from the dead. And we see that. But he offers a little bit of a warning here. For this reason, rejoice, O heavens, and you who dwell in them. Woe to the earth and to the sea, because the devil has come down, having great wrath, knowing that he has only a short time. What did that just say? It's not going to last forever, no. And Satan knows he's not going to last forever. He's already been thrown out of heaven, and he'll never return. And there's going to be a time when evil in every form, shape, form, and fashion is going to be destroyed. And Satan knows it. And in the interim, Satan's going to do what? He's going to lash out with everything he has. I couldn't help but thinking. First year I taught, which was a long teacher and a coach. And for the first time and only time, I had a junior high class. Last period of the day, right before athletics, 7 little 7th grade boys. I had just come off of writing a very scholarly master's thesis, and I have these little boys. And last period of the day, they're not really interested in history. In fact, to kind of give you an example, this one little boy that brought all this to mind, Bobby, and I'm trying to think of how I can say this very nicely. Bobby was very impulsive and didn't think things through. And one day, to give you an example, we're studying Stephen Austin going to Mexico and getting permission to bring the old 300 to Texas. And he stopped in Chihuahua and was arrested in Chihuahua. So I know these little boys can't spell Chihuahua. So I write up on the board. Now, to show how long ago, it was a chalkboard, okay? A lot of people don't even know what a chalkboard is anymore. I write up here on the chalkboard. I write Chihuahua. Bobby's hand straight jumps up. Yeah, Bobby? He said, what in the world is a chihuahua? I knew my work was going to be cut out for the rest of the... Anyway, but Bobby, what made me think about this, and kind of the illustration, and it may be a poor illustration, Bobby and some of his buddies were out hunting one weekend, and they come out to an old deserted farmhouse, and they see a big old raccoon. And Bobby, in his typical way, thinks that would make a great pet. Unfortunately, the coon goes under the old farmhouse. And Bobby, in his typical way, decides he's going to crawl under that house and get that coon and bring him out and make him his pet. If you can imagine being dumped in a tow sack with 12 liters at the same time, that's what Bobby looked like Monday morning when he came to school. I have never seen so many claw marks and scratches. That coon couldn't get out. There's only one way out. He was cornered. And he tore old Bobby up all over. And I asked Bobby, son, why would you do that? I thought it'd be a good idea. Well, I dare say Bobby never crawled back under a house after a pet coon before again. But I think about that when I think about Satan here. Satan is trapped. Satan can't get out. There's no way. And he's going to do everything he can to inflict damage on everybody whom he opposes. And that particularly includes whom? Christians. Yeah, Christians. And we'll talk more about that in just a moment. And the dragon saw that he was thrown down to earth. He persecuted the woman who had given birth to the male child. Now, who is the woman again? Christians, yeah. The Messianic community and before Christ is born, and the church after Christ is born. But 2 wings of the great eagle were given to the woman so that she could fly into the wilderness again, to her place where she was nourished for a time and times and a half a time from the presence of the serpent. Same thing, 3.5 years here. And the serpent poured the water like a river out of his mouth. Now notice there are 3 times he uses this word in his mouth, verses 15 and 16. After the woman, so that he might cause her to be swept away with the flood. But the earth helped the woman, and the earth opened up its mouth and drank up the river, which the dragon poured out of its mouth. Now we're going to see a whole bunch more of this symbolism. Same thing in chapter 13. But there's one thing. Turn back to Daniel 7 one more time. Because Daniel uses the same type of symbolic language. We just read verse 7 of chapter 7 a moment ago, where he's describing this beast with the 7 heads and the 10 horns. So again, we know it's Rome. And then verse 8, while I was contemplating the horns, behold, another horn, a little one, came up out of them, and the 3 of the first horns were pulled out by the roots before it. And behold, the horn possessed eyes, like, every time I told you to see like in apocalyptic literature, it means what? It's symbolic. Yeah, it's symbolic. Like the eyes of man, and the mouth uttering great boast. The same words used over there 3 times in 2 verses in chapter 12 of the book of Revelation. What do you think that could be, this mouth that was... Again, I know you know, you're just making sure I do. So I'll go ahead and tell you. Again, the scholars say undoubtedly this is talking about what we call today propaganda. Because the Roman Empire, remember we talked about that the Roman Empire said, who was God? The emperor. Remember the emperor cult that we talked about? And you had to pledge allegiance to the emperor cult, and you couldn't buy or sell anything without joining the trade guild, and you couldn't join the trade guild unless you pledged total allegiance and swore allegiance and worshipped the emperor. And scholars say that all likelihood that this barrage, constant barrage or propaganda we'd call it today, that was coming out of people's mouths, some people call it blasphemy. Blasphemy were coming out and threatened to sweep the Christians away. God's going to make sure that didn't happen. And so what happened is every form of opposition was going to be addressed by God. And if they were faithful and they endured whatever came their way, they were going to be victorious. Now we're just about finished. I'm going to give you a chance to ask some questions here in just a second. So the dragon was enraged with the woman, and he went off to make war with the rest of her children. What do you think that means? You know, if I were writing that for us right here, it's 2026, I'd say, rush off to oppose us. It's been that way ever since. Now we talked about one night in class, I think Bill was teaching and did an excellent job of talking about, are we persecuted today? Oh yeah, it's different from what they're looking at. I mean, I don't know about you, but nobody threatened to throw me in prison or kill me today by coming to worship. But there's persecution. He uses different tactics. And you know, I kind of get chasing a rabbit right here. I'm not sure that Satan's tactic in the United States may not be more effective than the persecution we read about in the first century. What does his tactic look like in our society? I'm sorry? I think it's drugs. Well, I think drugs is part of it. That's true. Jim?
It's really, we have that to me, as I studied on this, and it's a big thing to me, is they're very deceptive. They seem to be all for God, but it's the misleading and the confusion. If we think about it, the devil has a lot of lures, fishing lures, and he knows each one we need. Today, he tells us, which is one of the big things that bothers me, if we not to speak against because we offend somebody, and by doing this, we offend God, and we lead and we allow people to lead others astray. And so we feel very comfortable that all is well, and when it isn't.
Very good. I completely agree with you. What's a word, one word that we could use that he has used, that is used a great deal in our society. People have, starts with a C, people have become what? Complacent. Very, very good. And those of you that were here several months ago when Bill taught class, he read those results of that poll that talked about that in the United States of America, less than half of the people declared that they were quote unquote religious. Now, religious is a big generic term, but that scares me to death. That scares me. And we're talking on Wednesday night in Carlin's class, we're talking about that kind of the same thing. What percentage of young people leave the Lord's church? A huge number. Is that scary, baby, besides me? And it's just a second, Logan. It's a fact that people's faith tends to be a whole lot stronger when they're enduring persecution. Logan, go ahead.
I think a big part of that too is that we've slowly tried to take Christ out of our country, you know,
Yep.
out of our everyday lives. You know, Sunday used to be a day where everyone went to church, and then, you know, kind of a shutdown, if you will, right? Of that. Oh, I'm sure Saginaw was that way back in the day, right? Yeah. They're putting sports on Sundays now, yep. Right? There's now even a debate about putting the Ten Commandments up in schools, even though it's just the foundation of our country. It's nothing that, hey, we're not going to make you believe it, but we're going to have it there to show you where our thoughts of our country came from, right? And so I think that also has to do with why a lot of
and we talked about one of the 7 churches. You remember that was one of the things, really, Laodicea, the last one, where Jesus says, Revelation 3rd chapter, lukewarm nation toward the Lord. If that continues, it gets worse and worse and worse. And we see here, God, through John, is revealing this, don't after it. And it's like I say, we have persecution. It's just a different kind of persecution, but it's still there.
But gospel, I mean, I know it's very difficult. When we talk to the people, we got to be real careful. But no matter what, and I mean, we need to evangelize more.
Right, good point.
The pandemic has a lot of effect on people that quit going to church because they went YouTube as they were up. A lot of them have not returned.
Very true.
And another giving. I know in talking to where I live in a retirement center, discussions are down there from denominational people. And at all the denominations are having the same problem.
Oh, yeah.
And not only that, they're all hurting financially because lack of giving. And they forget it's scripture. All of it's scripture. But they've, I don't know if they've lost hope or they have been involved in maybe denominationalism, but that pandemic has affected a lot of things.
Yep.
I'm just saying that, okay?
Very good point.
Yeah.
Very good point.
And another thing, with so much technology we have, cell phones and all that, people, they think nowadays we can do everything. We don't need God.
Yep.
And so we feel like it's self-sufficient. And this is the way the devil is working on us.
Yep, very good. We're just about out of time. Those are excellent comments, but I really want to end with Ephesians, the 6th chapter. It's a passage you all know, and it ties right in with what this 12th chapter is saying. Ephesians, the 6th chapter, verse 12. Because, you know, in our society, Satan has basically marginalized his effectiveness. He basically told us there's no Satan, there's no sin. But listen to Ephesians the 6th chapter. I'll begin in verse 12. For our struggle is not against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, against the powers, against the world forces of this darkness, against the spiritual forces of wickedness in the heavenly places. Therefore, take up the full armor of God, so that you will be able to resist the evil one, doing all to stand and done everything to stand firm. What did you say? Wake up, be faithful, and let God will help you resist whatever comes your way. Isn't that the same thing that Revelation the 12th chapter just said 2,000 years ago? Same message, same exact message. And so we're going to end there for today. I appreciate all your comments. And next Sunday morning, Lord willing, we'll pick up in chapter 13. And there's a whole lot of chapter 13. You know, we talked about the fact Satan has attempted to defeat God and his people in the Messianic community with Christ. How did he try to stop Christ? Remember Herod the Great? What did Herod declare? Gonna kill all the male boys. That didn't succeed. God helped his parents get him down to Egypt so he wouldn't be killed. And then when they tacked him to the cross, Satan thought he did what? He won that. Well, the resurrection 3 days later, it didn't work. And then if you look at the fact, the church today, he's still trying to destroy Christ and us in the church. He's still there. The battle's still raging. The war's already been won. Thank y'all very much. We'll pick up there at chapter 13, Lord willing, next Sunday morning.